All right. Welcome, everybody, to Q&A. This is a little different today because, obviously, our internet's been down. But we want to keep up in the pattern of this. And so Dan has graciously prepared questions. And so Dan's going to grill me today, and we'll go somewhere with this discussion.
See how it goes. We have a very small audience of Cole and Renee, so just inviting you, if you have questions as we're talking, shout them out.
Yeah, shout them out, because you know what? This is our live audience, live studio
That's right.
audience.
Going with old school internet, which is just yell.
Yeah, just yeah. Right. All right. So where do you want to start, Dan?
Well, let's start at the very beginning.
Yeah, it's a good place. Very good place to start.
So we'll go with today's reading from Genesis.
Yeah.
And this is where Joseph's brothers are finally potentially in a position to get their comeuppance.
Yeah, right.
For all the hassle they've given Joseph.
Right.
And the passage opens with his brothers concocting a lie
Yeah.
to avoid retribution from Joseph.
Isn't it great?
Yeah. and that struck me because all three of our readings today really deal with forgiveness. Mm-hmm. But here they're not contrite.
No,
they're not repentant.
Right.
They just don't want to get what's due them.
Uh-huh.
So biblically, what is the message here?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, is that people don't change, or people do change, but they also don't change much, and so like it actually makes me think it's more realistic, honestly, because the same family dynamics play out no matter what, right?
Yeah.
And so here's these exact same family dynamics that have been at work at this family since, Jacob's grandfather, decided to lie about his wife being his wife when they were in Egypt. I mean, the whole, and that was the Abraham and Sarah in Egypt story. And so this is what this family does. They're a family of quite deceitful people along the way. If you read Jacob's story, he worked for 7 years for his first wife, and then his uncle literally tricked him into marrying the wrong woman, and then he had to work another 7 years to get to marry the woman he actually wanted to marry, and so this whole family is this deceitful mess, and yet here it is right at the end of the story, and so I get some comfort from that, actually, that forgiveness is at work, even in that your family dynamics don't have to be perfected for forgiveness to be at work. Thank God, right? Because none of our family dynamics are perfect or even sometimes working particularly well. And thank God that they don't have to be, for forgiveness to still happen.
Well, with that forgiveness then that Joseph is doing, and sometimes I kind of feel like, depending on the mood when I'm reading this passage, that Joseph knows they're trying to pull a fast one on him.
Oh, it's the most ham-fisted lie. It's an awful lie. You kind of want to. I would almost want to tell them, if I were just go back to the drawing board and try again. Just have some self-respect, please.
Yeah, Dad said. Yeah, Dad said.
Dad said. Yeah, it's really.
And try and ask him now.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Well, so given that, is Joseph truly forgiving them, or is he forgiving them just as a step toward his own acknowledgement that he realizes that they're not what's important? God wanted him in Egypt to save all those Egyptians.
Yeah. I don't think that's an either or. It's a yes. Joseph does do something that's really revolutionary in that at the moment he could choose retribution, he does not choose retribution, and I think we should not sail over that just because, every one of our stories, the people who deserve retribution get retribution.
Yeah.
This is the essence of all classical myth. This is the essence of every Greek, Roman mythology story. Oedipus Rex, right? Oedipus deserves retribution. That's the tragedy of the whole thing, is that he actually deserves everything he's getting because, he's a mess. And so unlike every other myth kind of in our world, Joseph chooses not to inflict retribution on people who deserve it. And so I don't think we should sail over that. And at the same time, yeah, I think part of forgiveness is realizing, you know what, there's bigger fish to fry. Like, there were bigger things at work that I was a part of that I didn't know about at the moment. And I don't think you can forgive until you have that realization too, you know, that, hey, there were other things happening. There were other forces at work, and I was just a small part. So I can forgive you because in the grand scheme of things,
It's not about me.
it's not right. Maybe I'm not actually that important, you know. Will Willimon, he's a preacher and a former bishop of Alabama, always used to tell this story, and he has this wonderful gentlemanly Southern accent, so he can say things I could never say because you feel good even if he's insulting you just by the tone of his voice. But he had a parishioner walk in and he said, "I came just to see you. The church roof might fall in because I'm here." And Bishop Willimon just looked at him and went, "You're really not that important." But, you know, like, part of forgiveness is sometimes that realization, like, maybe I'm actually not, you know, we say it every Ash Wednesday, right? You know, you are dust, to dust you shall return. Like, part of forgiveness is that realization of maybe there are larger things at work here.
And in that larger things tone, you know, there's this whole aspect, and it really struck me reading this passage. When we get to Exodus, Egypt is evil,
Yeah.
you know, but throughout the rest of the Bible, Egypt's a cool place. They're all right. You know, even later, it's a refuge for Joseph and Mary to get Jesus out before Herod can kill him as an infant. And even here, one of the ways it stands out, right before this scene, you know, we get Jacob's death. And I find it very intriguing that, and it says it right in the passage previous, Jacob is mummified, you know, which is something that was reserved in Egyptian society for only the highest of the high,
Right.
whether they were royalty or priests. But he gets full on mummified, and the Egyptian priests give him the Egyptian funerary salutes.
Right.
You know, what is that kind of thing saying? Where we have, you know, Egypt A portrayed really well, and then B, Jacob treated to these traditional Egyptian systems, and it's not looked upon askance, especially from a religious standpoint.
Right. Egypt is the place the people of God go to find temporary refuge, but they're never supposed to stay there, is kind of the overarching biblical narrative of Egypt.
Okay.
You know, and it's always a temptation to stay in Egypt. So whenever they stay for prolonged periods, problems happen. Because so Abraham flees to Egypt because of a famine. And it's fine at first, but then when he stays, that's when the whole mess with his wife and all that, you know. And so the people Jacob and his family go there for famine, but they stay for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then there's slavery, and, you know, and so it's not that Egypt is intrinsically evil, it's that Egypt presents this temptation. It's this refuge, but it's also temptation at the same time. It is both refuge in times of danger, but it's this place of it's this place of security that presents a temptation, because God actually calls us to be at risk. And so
So playing it safe in Egypt,
right, we're never supposed to stay there. You know, we can flee back to Egypt occasionally for good reason, you know, but we're never supposed to stay in Egypt. And even the whole story, you know, this is their primary temptation in the wilderness, right, is to go back. Let's go back because we were secure. You know, we had food, we had water, we had, you know, homes to live in.
Yeah.
We were secure.
may have been grueling labor, but
The flesh pots of Egypt, you know, I mean, you know, there was meat. We had prime rib. It was grueling labor, but we had prime rib by God.
as opposed to this manna stuff we're eating every single day.
Right. And it's no better than the wafers that, you know. Yeah. And so Right. Egypt is the place of temporary refuge that presents a temptation to security.
So there's no, and I just want to clarify this because what it struck me immediately as was, are we seeing an evolution of the biblical portrayal of God? In that Egypt's okay here, but then it's going to be something I'm going to be an angry God about later.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's, how to put this. I guess I would say God kind of alternates on his opinion on Egypt, and it just depends on the circumstance, so sometimes, again, it's the place he sends them, Mary and Joseph, go to Egypt, like, please, head there. And then sometimes it's Pharaoh, it's slavery, it's fear of not having enough. And then in other times, it's this untrustworthy thing, and it's just what situation are they in? Are they being tempted to that comfortable security, or are they not being tempted to it? That's kind of, because like even in the much later Old Testament, the southern kingdom of Judah, in its last days, tried to fight against Babylon. And they made an alliance with Egypt. And God brings up this same exact point. He's like, don't trust Egypt. But it's the same temptation that Egypt presents itself as comfortable security. We can be independent from Babylon. Egypt will protect us. We'll be safe. And it's that same kind of don't trust. And God's basic point is don't trust Egypt. They're not going to help you. And don't give in to that temptation to comfortable security.
That as you were talking about, slavery issue there, and that brings up a point that I found interesting reading this chapter again. In that, and then the gospel lesson too brings up slavery.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting is, in most of actually I think every English language version of the Bible I've read, Joseph's brothers, I think, what's the line? That his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves."
Yeah.
And I see that in all the English language versions, but when I look at a Jewish, the Tanakh, and I look at one of those translations into English, they use the term bondsman or bondman instead of slavery. And on the surface, they seem like the same thing, but they really mean two different things.
Yeah.
Why? What's the difference? What's the original Hebrew, and is it just a question of how it's being interpreted?
No. Well, it has to do more with slavery itself as a When we as Americans and in the English-speaking world, when we hear slavery, we hear American chattel slavery. American slavery was a very different institution than ancient world slavery.
I think that's important because I don't think most people realize.
Yeah, because there's a reason, like in American history, we called slavery the peculiar institution. It's because our slavery is actually much different. The idea where you were born into slavery and you were permanently a slave and you had no hope of ever not being a slave, that was and it was all based on race, that was a very unique evil that we did. Most slavery didn't work like that in most of the world for a lot of times. And so the ancient world, slavery was, you frequently had a chance to get out. And so like kids weren't born into slavery because why would you birth a child into slavery? I'm going to get out in a couple of years, and so sometimes, some translations will say bondsman because, again, just what we hear when we hear slave, we automatically think to 1861, and that's kind of our, and that's even our thought process because in American history, that's how we've actually used those past for good reason. We've used the Exodus story and these things about slaves as referencing our own institution, but when the Bible talks about slavery, when Paul sends, Paul has a whole letter about a slave returning to his master, but, but when Paul sends, Paul has a whole letter about a slave returning to his master, but, but when Paul sends, Paul has a whole letter about a slave returning to his master, but, but when Paul sends, Paul has a whole letter about a slave returning to his master, but, but when Paul sends, Paul has a whole letter about a slave returning to his master, but slavery is much different than, it's still bad. Don't get me wrong, it's bad, but it's different. In ancient Rome, a slave had rights. A slave actually had legal rights in the ancient world. You could not kill them. For example, killing a slave was still bad. And so there are just differences, and sometimes they try and reflect that in the language. I kind of think you're supposed to hear the harshness, so I would translate it as slave, just because I think you're supposed to hear the harsh tone that's right there. But similarly, when Paul says, I'm a slave of Christ Jesus, sometimes people will say, oh, servant, and I think we're supposed to hear slave, because the harshness of the tone is what you're supposed to get there.
And react to and absorb.
Right, and react to it. It wants to get your attention with that term.
Yeah, I suspect we're going to be coming back to that.
Almost certainly.
Various aspects of that.
Yeah.
So moving on to Paul then, since you mentioned, Paul is a slave to Jesus. His letter today, and a lot of his letters actually, they often come across as like advice columns.
Especially at the end when they're, especially at the end.
And you've mentioned before too that the letters that survive that we get to see, a lot of them he was trying to answer problems that were arising in his congregations. So today's reading was from Romans. What were the issues in the Roman congregation? Because it seems like a lot of them still exist today in regular churches.
Romans is a weird. So he doesn't know this This is not a congregation he started. And so this is different from all his other letters where he's writing to a congregation that he actually started. And so he knows people there, because we get this long list of people at the end that he says hi to. And so clearly he knows people in this congregation, but he doesn't actually know them, as a whole. And he hasn't been there yet, and so best we can tell, this is a guess, because we don't have any, we weren't there. But best guess is that it was a springboard. Paul's big idea is that he's going to get to Spain, because Spain is like the furthest ends of the universe in their world. And so if he can get to Spain, then he'll have brought the gospel
to all the known world.
Right, to all the known world, right. And that's and Rome sits very conveniently in the middle. And so if he can use Rome as this springboard to Spain, and so he's kind of introducing himself right at the beginning. The other issue in this congregation, probably, again, this is all a good guess, but is that a couple of years before Paul wrote, the emperor had kicked out all Jews out of Rome. And so we think this started as a Jewish congregation, but then it became a Gentile Christian when the emperor exiled all the Jews from Rome. Now,
just for historical perspective, was that right around the time period that there was the rebellion in Israel? And
no, it's actually before that. Tacitus, who's our Roman historian friend, who's not a friend of Christianity, so when Tacitus talks about Christianity,
it's not glowing terms.
It's not glowing terms, but he's also pretty accurate because he's not interested in making it look good, and so we have this line from Tacitus where he says the Emperor Claudius kicked out all the Jews over a problem over Christus, which we think he didn't care, and so he spelled Christ's name wrong is kind of our best guess.
So you meant like Christos?
Right, Christos, or, and he's Latin, and all these people were Greek speaking, and so he probably just heard it wrong. But, and so there was some kind of thing going wrong in the world, in the local Jewish community. It was probably debates over Jesus as Messiah, and the Emperor Claudius's response is just to exile every Jewish person from the city. But that leaves this church with just Gentiles. And suddenly a formerly Jewish congregation becomes very Gentile in its outlook. And now the Emperor Claudius is dead, and those those former congregants are coming back. And so while they've been gone, and they've been gone for like 5+ years,
Yeah.
their congregation has changed. What does that mean? And that's kind of, it's never the direct issue, but it's lurking in the background. It's why he spends so much time on especially in these later sections, get along, love one another, all that stuff. It's because this congregation's figuring out, what do we do? The character of the whole community changed very drastically,
That gives a lot of perspective, because otherwise this especially this passage comes across like Paul's bought into the I'm okay, you're okay pop site culture.
Yeah, right. And he's not that at all. And I think what he's trying to get at is, and again, this is all like, there will be biblical scholars who disagree with every word I'm saying at the moment.
But this is your show, so you can go
right,
ahead.
But this is my show. The best evidence I have read, and that's all kind of lurking in the background for these people, and so that's why it hits so hard on, like Romans 1-2 hits so hard on everybody's sinful. Mm-hmm. The whole thing is this lead up to Paul trying to get both these groups to understand you're both really messed up and you both need grace about the same amount, so just accept that.
Yeah.
And it's why in this, right, it sounds kind of like an advice column, I think. So
What's interesting is that whole, as you were telling me about the Jews being kicked out of Rome, then coming back, and that creates problems in the congregation. Mm-hmm. It's almost like, it strikes me as the Babylonian exile in miniature, when the Jews who were exiled to Babylon come back, and the Jews who had stayed in the area, were like not very cool with what the returning exiles wanted to do.
Right. Like, what do you mean? You're the holy community. Right. Yeah. It is a lot similar. Yeah. I would agree with that.
Cycles and cycles.
Yeah. One more question.
One more. Oh, well, let's go then to the gospel.
Okay.
We'll move up to that. We'll make it the big picture, right? So all of today's readings are hitting us over the head with some aspect of forgiveness.
Right.
And how important it is. Mm-hmm. So what is it? Why do Joseph and Paul and Jesus all see forgiveness as so important, and not just in a trite way? We almost need a new word for forgiveness in the way they use it, because it is complete, it is total forgiveness.
Okay, so my perspective is it's because without it, we are caught in these ever-escalating cycles of retribution, and this is actually the easy, you can turn on the news and see this all the time today, and so one side does something, and then the other side does something worse, and then the other side does something worse, and then the other side does something worse, and that keeps going back and forth until, the way we usually solve it is we pick an innocent third party to blame, and we all just gang up on them, and then suddenly we're all united again because there's an innocent, because there's they're the problem, whoever the there is. They're the true problem, not our, back and forth, but they're the true problem.
We create a they with a capital T.
Yeah, right. They, those people. Whenever somebody's saying those people, they're trying to do this process to you. We are caught in that cycle, and the only way out is that somebody has to forgive. Somebody just has to forgive. That's the only way out. And so the Bible hits us over the head again and again and again is, you got to do this, because the only way toward new life, the only way toward breaking this cycle and getting any of that abundant life that Jesus talks about in the Gospels all the time is, stopping. Mm-hmm. Like, you got to forget. I had a professor who went to Israel on Palestine on a trip once, and he said, well, the real problem is somebody's got to take it on the chin. Somebody's got to decide to break this cycle and take it on the chin. And that's kind of true for us, is that, somebody's got to decide to do this. The Bible's answer is, God's already done this to you, so you should do this to other people. And The Bible's solution to that is Jesus is raised from the dead. Like, you can afford to break the cycle because worse comes to worse, I will raise you from the dead. And so they can't actually do anything to you.
Yeah. So even if you take it on the chin so hard that they kill you,
Right.
don't worry about it.
Right. Don't worry about it because Easter Sunday is next week and we'll be good. That you can be the people to do this because I will raise you from the dead. But that's the Bible's answer. So, yeah.
That's a heavy note to end on.
Well, I mean,
But
it's true though, right? I mean, it's heavy, but it's what our world needs. I
Yeah.
mean, I think if we're honest about it, I think this is the cycle a lot of groups are caught in that are, if you think about binaries in our world,
well, especially now in election season.
Yeah, I mean, right. And it's not, this isn't a pitch for neutrality. I'm not saying neutrality is good, but one side does something and then another side will do something worse, and that doesn't mean be stuck in the middle. No, but that means the only way to break the cycle is to actually, say, hey, I'll take, I don't need to go into the retribution game.
Yeah.
And like always, the fear is that eventually both sides will go back and forth so long as that we'll pick an innocent third party to blame so that we can be united.
Yeah. And then you've just created another binary that had combined others.
Right. Or you create the extreme example, right, is always to use Nazis. But this was there was the fascists and the communists, and they were going back and forth, and until the fascists hit upon the solution, we'll blame the Jews, which have nothing to do with anything.
Yeah, in a political or socio context.
Right,
Yeah.
there's nothing, they're not the problem, but was everybody, suddenly you find a third party, suddenly everybody's united behind, and that's an extreme example, but you see this at work in smaller institutes. And churches do this all the time with individuals. People will be there will be an argument in church. There will be factions, and then suddenly everybody's decided to be mean to, John Smith sitting in the back row, who has nothing to do with the conflict. But if we're all mean to him, then at least we can be united. And John Smith leaves,
And what does that really solve?
Well, right.
Yeah.
But the trick there is that the cycle repeats itself.
Yeah.
And so yes, you'll get peace with John Smith being kicked out, but only temporarily. And the only way out of it is to say, no, I'm not going to play that game anymore.
Well, the concluding wisdom that I'm getting from that is forgiveness isn't just about love. It also takes courage.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It does. Yep. Amen to that.
All right.
We'll be back actually live next time, so you can ask your questions. Thank you for watching.
Yeah, and you can submit them in advance, so
Right.
next time it won't just be my prepared questions.
Yeah.
But no, it would be nice to have a reserve of questions from you that we can go to as well.
So email me if there's a dying church question that you're just burning inside of you, but you've never asked before.
Yeah. Or, telepathically send it to us, however you want.
We'll try. I'm a little dense on that one, but you might need to try a couple times.
Yeah, me too. So.
Yeah.
But thanks again. It was,
Thank you.
This is always wonderful.
It is. It's fun.
Bye, everybody.